itself in two. This effect was equivalent to that produced by Joshua's horns at Jericho, or the danger that could be initiated by soldiers marching in lockstep across a suspension bridge. If their beat struck the resonant frequency, the bridge would sway violently and possibly collapse. Thus soldiers are trained to break stride while walking across bridges to avoid this amazing type of catastrophe. The World's Columbian Exposition, the scene by night. Inadequate as words have been found to convey a realizing idea of the beauty and grandeur of the spectacle which the exposition offers by day, they are infinitely less capable of affording the slightest conception of the dazzling spectacle which greets the eye of the visitor by night. Indescribable by language are the electric fountains. One of them, called the Great Geyser, rises to a height of 150 feet above a band of little geysers. By adding rotating colored lights, the effects created are so bewildering no eye can find the loveliest. Their vagaries of motion so entrancing no heart can keep it steady beating. W. E. Cameron. On May the 1st, the Chicago World's Fair, or Columbian Exposition, opened. This auspicious occasion came at a paradoxical time for the country, for on the one hand, the United States had announced that it was the new leader in the creation and deployment of new technology. On the other hand, it was embroiled in the panic of 1893. Simultaneously, and for one exceptional time, the world at large was experiencing universal peace. The Columbian Exposition covered almost 700 acres, had 60,000 exhibitors, and cost $25 million. With 28 million attendees, the Chicago Fair boasted a $2.25 million profit. Whereas the Paris Exposition of 1889 had the stupendous 984-foot-tall Eiffel Tower, the Chicago Fair boasted the Ferris wheel. Revolving on the largest one-piece axle ever forged, the wheel stood 264 feet high and had a seating capacity of over 2,000. Every day, hundreds of thousands of visitors from every corner of the globe streamed into Chicago's White City. The chief architect, Chicagoan Daniel Hudson Burnham, along with the other planners, based their design on a city of waterways, much like Venice, with a court of honor centrally placed to house the major palaces. With wooden facades made to resemble marble, the buildings rivaled even the great stone achievements of the ancient Romans and Greeks. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Pavilion, more than twice the size of the others, was by far the largest building in the world. Nearly a third of a mile long and well over 2 football fields wide, the structure covered 30.5 acres and had a seating capacity of 75,000. Abutting Lake Michigan at the far end above the Court of Honor, with columns extended like the arms of a mighty conductor, was the magnificent arch and peristyle. Designed by head sculptor Auguste Saint-Gaudens, this statue depicted a general representing Christopher Columbus thunderously entering the fair with his mighty team of horses. Beneath this quadriga was the great gilded 65-foot statue of the Republic, which rose from the main canal like a benevolent behemoth as it blessed not only the Manufacturers' Pavilion, but also palaces for agriculture, designed by Stanford White, machinery, administration, and electricity. And that was just the Court of Honor. Running perpendicular to the great quadrangle for nearly a mile was yet another opulently lined moat containing most of the other large-scale pavilions and displays, described in one text as a cacophonous confusion of advanced cultures, converted heathens, peculiar tongues, and queer importations. With a fleet of 50 gondolas driven by brand-new electrical engines, visitors could motor to any pavilion they wanted. The Electricity Pavilion, adorned with a dozen elegant minarets, 4 of which rose 169 feet above the hall, was over 2 football fields in length and nearly half that measure in width. Covering 3½ acres, this spacious and stately structure befitted the seat of the most novel and brilliant exhibit of the Columbian Exposition. The ex-governor of the state of Illinois, William E. Cameron, described the palace as housing the magical achievements of Mr. Edison and his brother wizards. Containing the names of the forefathers of the science above a formidable statue of Benjamin Franklin launching his kite at the main vestibule, Electricity Hall presented a fascinating potpourri of advanced technologies. Foremost among the exhibitors were the megalithic corporations such as Westinghouse and GE from America and the more modest-sized AEG from Germany. Whereas AEG reproduced some of the AC equipment Brown and Dobrovolsky used in their epoch-making 108-mile Laufen to Frankfurt transmission, GE presented its own AC system. Westinghouse, having won the bid to light the fair with the only bona fide patents, was in an odd situation. Legally, it should have been able to block the competitors from advertising pirated apparatus, but pragmatically, considering time limitations and other factors, such a tactical action was out of the question. In fact, in some ways, they owed AEG gratitude for pointing the way. Their course was to make it clear that there was only one inventor. And so they erected a 45-foot-high monument in the center aisle of Electricity Hall, which proclaimed the truth to the world. The testimonial read in big, bold letters, Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, Tesla Polyphase System. And with this method, from an annex of Machinery Hall, Westinghouse illuminated the entire World's Fair. Having manufactured 250,000 Sawyer-Man stopper lamps for the occasion, Westinghouse generated 3 times more electrical energy than was then being utilized in the entire city of Chicago. Not to be eclipsed, GE constructed a scintillating 82-foot-high Tower of Light in the exact center of Electricity Hall. It comprised 18,000 lamps running the full length of the pedestal, capped by a single enormous Edison light bulb ignited at the apex. Other features within Electricity Hall included, on the second floor, electrical gadgets to cure all ills, such as charged belts, electrical hairbrushes, and body invigorators, and on the main floor, displays by the most prominent inventors of the day. Elihu Thomson, for instance, unleashed a high-frequency coil that created sparks 5 feet long. Alexander Graham Bell unveiled a telephone that could transmit voice via light beams. And Elisha Gray presented his teleautography machine, a precursor of today's fax machine. For a few cents, it would reproduce a person's signature electronically at a distance. Tom Edison presented his own cornucopia of gadgets, including the multiplex telegraph, the fantastic talking machine known as the phonograph, and his kinetoscope, which for the first time in a public forum displayed the varying labile movements of a human being in motion. Tesla's exhibit, which occupied part of the Westinghouse space, featured a number of his early AC devices, including motors, armatures, and generators, phosphorescent signs of noted electricians such as Helmholtz, Faraday, Maxwell, Henry, and Franklin, and a sign for his favorite Serbian poet, Jovan Shmaj Jovanović. Tesla also displayed vacuum tubes illuminated by means of wireless transmission, his rotating egg of Columbus, sheets of crackling light created by high-frequency discharges between 2 insulated plates, and other neon signs reading Westinghouse and Welcome Electricians. These last 2 displays produced the effect of a modified lightning discharge, accompanied by a similar deafening noise. This was probably one of the most novel attractions, in a sensational way, seen in the building, as the noise could be heard anywhere within Electricity Building, and the flash of the miniature lightning was very brilliant and startling. Tesla traveled to Chicago in August, not only to visit the fair and present a week of demonstrations, but also to attend the International Electrical Congress that was held there for that month. At Electricity Hall, Professor Tesla announces he will send a current of 100,000 volts through his own body without injury to life, an experiment which seems all the more wonderful when we recall the fact that the currents made use of for executing murderers at Sing Sing, New York, have never exceeded 2,000 volts. Mr. Tesla also shows a number of other interesting experiments, some of which are so marvelous as to be almost beyond description. On August the 25th, Nikola Tesla spoke before 1,000 electrical engineers at the International Electrical Congress in Agriculture Hall. In attendance was a galaxy of notables, including Galileo Ferraris, Sir William Preece, Sylvanus Thomson, Elihu Thomson, and honorary chairman Hermann Ludwig von Helmholtz, whom Tesla also took on a tour of his personal exhibit. People crowded about the doors and clamored for admittance. The great majority of those who came with the expectation of seeing Tesla pass a current of 250,000 volts through his body. $10 was offered for a single seat, and offered in vain. Only members of the Electrical Congress with their wives were admitted, and not even they unless they were provided with credentials. Before the lecture, a Chicago reporter inquired of Professors William Preece and Sylvanus Thomson as to the use of the various equipment scattered about the hall, but they gazed in wonder and confessed they could not guess. They simply lumped off the whole lot under the generic term of Tesla's animals. Presently, white-haired Elisha Gray was seen escorting a tall, gaunt young man toward the platform. The young man smiled with pleasure, but modestly kept his eyes on the floor. His cheeks were hollow, his black eyes sunken, but sparkling with animation. Intense and continuous application of his work had sapped his energy, until his friends say he has almost reached the point of dissolution. A gentleman who dined with him a week ago says he could scarcely make himself heard across the table, he was so worn out. He has glossy black hair, parted in the middle, a mustache, heavy under his aquiline nose, but fading to a suggestion at the sides of his mouth. His ears are large and stand out from his head. He wore a neat four-button cutaway suit of brownish grey. Gray said to a rousing applause, "I give you the wizard of physics, Nikola Tesla." I have, with great reluctance, accepted these compliments, because I had no right to interrupt the flow of speech of our chairman. Tesla began with characteristic humour. Appearing somewhat like a resurrected cadaver, Tesla spoke to allay the fears of all those concerned for his frail health. A number of scientific men urged a group of electricians to deliver a lecture. A great many promised that they would come, but when the program was sifted down, I was the only healthy man left, and so I managed to take some of my apparatus and give you a brief outline of some of my work. Tesla proceeded to display his new steam generators and mechanical oscillators, some of which were so compact that one could readily carry them in the crown of one's hat. He told the audience that his goals were multifaceted. Such a device could, among other things, be used to run motors with perfect synchrony, or electric clocks. He had also produced a continuous wave radio transmitter, although no one at that time understood the complete ramifications of the equipment. Nevertheless, when the resonant frequency was reached, wireless lights would again illuminate, and in that way intelligence was wirelessly transmitted. One of Tesla's more unusual exhibits, which was similar to his egg of Columbus, was another ring which displayed not only the principles of the rotating magnetic field, but also his theory of planetary motion. In this experiment, one large and several small brass balls were usually employed. When the field was energized, all the balls would be set spinning, the large ones remaining in the center, while the small ones revolved around it like moons about a planet, gradually receding until they reached the outer guard and raced along the same. But the demonstration which most impressed the audiences was the simultaneous operation of numerous balls, pivoted discs, and other devices placed in all sorts of positions and at considerable distances from the rotating field. When the currents were turned on and the whole animated with motion, it presented an unforgettable spectacle. Mr. Tesla had many vacuum bulbs in which small light metal discs were pivotally arranged on jewels, and these would spin anywhere in the hall when the iron ring was energized. Tesla returned to New York, exhausted but exhilarated. 13. The Filipovs, 1894. Mr. Tesla has been held a visionary, deceived by the flash of casual shooting stars, but the growing conviction of his professional brethren is that because he saw farther, he saw first the low lights flickering on the tangible new continents of science. The perceptive and imaginative qualities of the mind are not often equally marked in the same man of genius. T.C. Martin. Fame had arrived, and at all levels. In engineering circles, Tesla was known as one of the most remarkable discoverers of the age. To the magazines as, heaven forbid, the new Edison, to the newspapers as our foremost electrician, to the masses as a wondrous wizard from a strange land, and to the financiers as bankable. Having recognized the virtuoso from the outset, T.C. Martin, as head trumpeter, was now helping choreograph Tesla's vault into the public arena. Comerford, as he was known to his friends, had generated a propitious relationship to all concerned when he met with Robert Underwood Johnson, associate editor of the Century, to propose a feature article on the thriving electronic savant. "Take a seat," Johnson offered as he scanned through toppling stacks of manuscripts scattered about the office to find a chair that could be easily cleared. A brother of a congressman and a poet, Johnson had in 1889 been honored by the city when he was chosen to contribute an original sonnet for the unveiling of the Washington Square Arch, which he read before President Harrison and other dignitaries. A temporary structure designed by Stanford White, commemorating 100 years since the inauguration of George Washington, this arch predated by a few years the permanent marble arch also designed by White. Johnson was also knowledgeable about inventors, having visited Edison's laboratory in the early 1880s as a reporter for Scribner's Monthly, the precursor of the Century. Tesla, no doubt, had already piqued his interest. Impressed with the eloquent portrait Martin had painted of Tesla, Johnson invited his colleague over for dinner. "Why not bring the wizard along? Perhaps there is more than one article here for the offing." On a first-name basis with such personalities as mayoral candidate Theodore Roosevelt and writer Mark Twain, two frequent visitors to his Union Square office, Johnson and his ebullient wife Catherine were the very essence of the phrase gracious hosts. Through their dinner parties at their home at 327 Lexington Avenue, a visitor could dine with any number of luminaries such as sculptor Auguste Saint-Gaudens, actress Eleonora Duse, poet and editor-in-chief of the Century Richard Watson Gilder, naturalist John Muir, activist for children's rights Mary Mapes Dodge, conductor of the Boston Symphony Monsieur Guericke, composer and pianist Ignacy Paderewski, thespian Joseph Jefferson, or writer extraordinaire Rudyard Kipling. Johnson had just returned with his wife from their second trip to Europe, where they had, by chance, run into Twain in Venice. The world was a cosy and romantic place for the Johnsons, in part because they found it that way, and in part because they moulded it that way. Martin arrived with a pallid, drawn and haggard Tesla at the Johnson home in the middle of the Christmas season. They were greeted by Catherine and Robert Johnson and their two children, Agnes, who was about 16, and Owen, who was 2 or 3 years younger. The inventor's frail condition, which one reporter described as having reached the limits of human endurance, took the Johnsons, especially Catherine, by surprise. A facile conversationalist, Catherine was a striking woman of Irish descent, poised, with shoulders swept back, her head held erect. Although her hair was now beginning to streak grey, she still exuded an air of youth. It was her eyes in particular that visitors were drawn to. Slightly coquettish, they displayed a daring sense of play beneath a wistful stare. Triggering a constellation of emotions, ranging from maternal instincts to beguilement, Catherine became enthralled, some would say mesmerized, by the Serbian Superman who had entered her world, and he had taken to her. Tesla talked about his European tour, particularly his meeting with Sir William Crookes, and the Johnsons invited him for Christmas. "You are overworked, Mr. Tesla, and you should take a holiday," Catherine declared. "Perhaps a good Christmas meal would keep you going through the first months of the new year." "I get all the nourishment I require from my laboratory," Tesla retorted. "I know I am completely worn out, and yet I cannot stop my work. These experiments of mine are so important, so beautiful, so fascinating, that I can hardly tear myself away from them to eat, and when I try to sleep, I think about them constantly. I expect I shall go on until I break down altogether. Come, let us go there for our dessert." A carriage was called, and in short order the Johnsons were lured to the magician's den. "Be prepared for a surprise or two," Tesla said, as he, in the words of a reporter who experienced a similar episode, ushered them into a room some 25 feet square, lighted on one side by two broad windows, partially covered by heavy black curtains. The laboratory was literally filled with curious mechanical appliances of every description. Snake-like cables ran along the walls, ceiling, and floor. In the center was an electric dynamo, which sat upon a large circular table covered with thick strips of black woolen cloth. Two large brownish globes, 18 inches in diameter, were suspended from the ceiling by cords. Composed of brass, coated and insulated with wax, these globes served the purpose of spreading the electrostatic field. Tesla shut the doors and drew the curtains, until every chink or crevice for the admission of light was concealed, and the laboratory bathed in absolutely impenetrable gloom. As we awaited developments, exquisitely beautiful luminous signs and devices of mystic origin began to flash about. Sometimes they seemed iridescent, the entire room filled with electric vibrations, as tubes and bulbs, which we held, became luminous. What impressed us most of all, perhaps, was the simple but cheerful fact that we remained unscathed, while electrical bombardments were taking place on every side. A few days later, in honor of the celebration of the Serbian Christmas on January the 6th, Catherine sent Tesla a bouquet. "I have to thank Mrs. Johnson for the magnificent flowers," Tesla wrote Robert. "I have never received flowers before, and they produced upon me a curious effect." Tesla would return to the Johnson home on a regular basis for dinner, or after an evening on his own for a late nightcap, and the inventor reciprocated by taking the Johnsons out on the town. They would be attending the gala performance of Dvorak's New World Symphony. "Upon receipt of your first note," Tesla wrote Robert, "I immediately secured the best seats I could for Saturday. Nothing better than the 15th row. Very sorry. We shall have to use telescopes. But I think the better for Mrs. Johnson's vivid imagination. Dinner at Delmonico's." Intrigued with Tesla's fascinating heritage, Robert became interested in Serbian poetry, and so Tesla began to translate for him. They obtained permission from Shmai Jovanović to feature some of his poems for inclusion in the Century, and also in a book Johnson entitled Songs of Liberty. Their favorite was undoubtedly the ballad about a warrior from a Montenegrin battle which took place in 1874. Luka Filipov. "One more hero to be part of the Servians' glory. Lute to lute and heart to heart tell the homely story. Let the Moslem hide for shame, trembling like the falcon's game, thinking on the falcon's name, Luka Filipov." The verse goes on to describe a fierce battle in which Luka captures a pasha and marches him back to the prince. However, on the way, Luka becomes wounded in an ambush, so his soldiers decide to retaliate by killing the arrested Turk. "We'd have fired, but Luka's hand rose in protestation, while his pistol's mute command needed no translation. For the Turk retraced his track, knelt and took upon his back, as a peddler lifts his pack, Luka Filipov. How we cheered him as he passed through the line, a swinging gun and pistol, bleeding fast, grim but loudly singing. But as couriers came to say that our friends had won the day, who should up and faint away? Luka Filipov." One can easily envision Robert's and Catherine's eyes aglow as Tesla spontaneously translated Shmai's ode in their living room one special evening, and how Robert worked to hone it for publication. From this moment on, Brother Robert would be known as Dear Luka, and Catherine would be addressed as Mrs. Filipov. To Catherine, Tesla was more than a man. He was an icon of historical importance, a trophy to display before her lady friends, and even more than this, he was a tangible symbol of intangible longings. In her essence, Catherine was a frustrated artist whose ever-present yearnings pulled her from moments of exultation to the edge of despair. She must have been a difficult person to live with, but like Tesla, she had the capability to spark that realm that makes life all the more worth living. Selfish, egocentric, and histrionic at times, Catherine also had a dominant streak that not only pulled people to her, but manipulated them to her needs. Even the elusive hermit became a fly in her web. "Dear Mr. Tesla," she wrote in January 1894, We have had a hospital here since Thursday, Robert and Agnes, the invalids. Robert is better, but not out, and we want you to come this evening and brighten us up. As a great favour, come to us immediately." This beckoning to her auxiliary mate became a recurrent theme that replayed itself again and again through the next many years. For instance, in 1896, she wrote, "Dear Mr. Tesla, I shall expect to see you tomorrow evening." In 1897, "Come soon." And in 1898, "Will you come and see me tomorrow evening, and will you try to come a little early? I want very much to see you, and will be really disappointed if you do not think my request worthy of your consideration." But Catherine was not alone in her infatuation. T.C. Martin had discovered him, but Robert would soon become Tesla's closest confidant. A triad of intimacy quickly transpired as Comerford Martin's hold on the inventor began to loosen, and just as much as the Johnsons would come to cherish Tesla, he would cherish them. Here was a loving family the isolate could bind to. Tesla's health constantly was an issue not only for their own concerns, but also for the good of the species. Martin, whose new article in the Century would certainly serve to advance his own career as well as Tesla's, was just as solicitous, and he discussed the precariousness of the situation with Catherine. "I do not believe that he will give up work at any very early date," Martin wrote. Talking of California with him in a casual way elicited the fact that he had had a couple of invitations to lecture there, so that I don't want to jam his head into that lion's mouth. I believe he is going to take more care of himself, and you may have done us all a great deal of service by your timely words. Yet in spite of that, Martin continued, I fear he will go on in the delusion that woman is generically a Delilah who would shear him of his locks. If you can manage it, I believe it would be a good scheme to have that doctor get hold of him. My prescription is a weekly lecture from Mrs. R.U.J. This passage by a Tesla colleague is a rare glimpse at one of the enduring mysteries about Tesla, namely his supposed celibacy and mysterious sexual inclinations. By coincidence, only a fortnight later, Heinrich Hertz was dead. He was only 36. Martin wrote to Tesla, "For God's sake, let it be a warning to you. All Europe mourns for such an untimely taking off." But Tesla would take no heed, and his custom of driving himself to the limit would be a style of living that he would continue for many years. The future of the race and his role in it was clear to him. Nothing could stand in his way. "The time will come," Tesla told Catherine, "when crossing the ocean by steamer, you will be able to have a daily newspaper on board, with the important news of the world, and when by means of a pocket instrument and a wire stuck in the ground, you can communicate from any distance with friends at home through an instrument similarly attuned." His gaze and seeming powers of divination took her breath away. Penetrating his inner sanctum only added to her captivation. At the outset, Tesla's unparalleled achievements, explosion into international stardom, and promise for the future generated an express desire for all to cash in, to sell his multitudinous array of inventions so that they could ascend together to the next social rung. Their goal was to become millionaires. Tesla's cold light appeared to be the first ticket. As Martin's erudite biographical essay had received words of praise even from competitors, Johnson suggested that they plan a second piece, one that featured the lab. Johnson would get some of his more famous friends to come, and photos would be taken. This would be an exclusive, the first ever with the new revolutionary cold light. Johnson writes, "We were frequently invited to witness his experiments, which included the production of electrical vibrations of an intensity not before achieved. Lightning-like flashes of the length of 15 feet were an everyday occurrence, and his tubes of electric light were used to make photographs of many of his friends as souvenir of their visits. He was the first person to make use of phosphorescent light for photographic purposes, not a small item of invention in itself. I was one of a group consisting of Mark Twain, Joseph Jefferson, Marion Crawford, and others who had the unique experience of being thus photographed." Naturally, the Twain pictures would become the centerpiece. S.L. Clemens, as he signed his letters to Tesla, came to the laboratory on March the 4th, 1894, and again on April the 26th. Twain wrote to postpone the initial meeting for one day, and Tesla and Johnson exchanged notes about it. Curiously, Twain's private log for this period makes no reference to the occasion. He had dined with Stanford White at his Madison Square Garden Tower in January, and the following month had received a notice that $160,000 in royalties were coming his way because of the Page typesetting machine which he had backed. But that was all he jotted down, even though Twain had been aware of Tesla from the very first moment that the inventor had gone public with his creation of the AC polyphase system. Back in November 1888, Twain had written, "I have just seen the drawings and description of an electrical machine lately patented by Mr. Tesla and sold to the Westinghouse Company, which will revolutionize the whole electric business of the world. It is the most valuable patent since the telephone." Twain had run into Tesla on occasion at the Players Club or Delmonico's or at the artist Robert Reed's studio. One night, in Twain's words, the worldwide illustrious electrician had joined the Reed party. Jokes and stories were swapped and songs were sung, particularly Kipling's On the Road to Mandalay. Tesla related the story of how Twain's book saved his life when he was a boy of 12 struck down with a case of malaria, and this tale served to endear Tesla to Twain to the point of bringing tears to the writer's eyes. Interested in inventions and their exploitation, Twain asked Tesla at the lab if it would be all right if he could sell high-frequency electrotherapy machines to rich widows in Europe upon his next sojourn. The inventor naturally agreed. Tesla, in turn, showed the great writer yet another creation which he claimed would help these widows digest their meals. This contraption, he explained, consists of a platform supported on elastic cushions that are made to oscillate by means of compressed air. One day I stepped on the platform, and the vibrations imparted were transmitted to my body. Evidently, these isochronous rapid oscillations stimulated powerfully the peristaltic movements which propelled the foodstuffs through the alimentary channels. "You mean it'll make me regular?" Twain inquired. "Precisely, and without the use of elixirs, specific remedies, or internal applications whatever." Without further ado, Twain stepped aboard, as Tesla tried to stop his assistants from chuckling. As Twain had been so enthusiastic, Tesla neglected to inform him that peristaltic action is induced almost immediately. Suddenly, Twain felt an unspeakable and pressing necessity which had to be promptly satisfied. Tesla told the Johnsons the next day, to their tearful glee, for he had to jump off the platform and find his way swiftly to the lavatory. "I think I'll start with the electrotherapy machines," Twain said upon his return. "Wouldn't want the widows to get too healthy all at one shot." The photos of Twain and the others were processed nearly one full year before they would appear in print. Tesla was elated and commented to Johnson that the one of Joseph Jefferson was simply immense. "I mean the one showing him alone in the darkness. I think it is a work of art." Catherine suggested that they all celebrate at Delmonico's, and that he then join them for a summer holiday at the Hamptons. Tesla wrote back, "I fear that if I depart very often from my simple habits, I shall come to grief." However, realizing that he would soon be missing the pleasure of your company, he reluctantly agreed to go to dinner, but not to the holiday, and therefore signed off, "In the anticipation of the joy of dining with friends and subsequent sorrows, I remain yours sincerely, N. Tesla." Concerning the photographs, which were the first ever taken with phosphorescent lights, Tesla, who had his eye on potential investors, became impatient for the publicity, but Martin and Johnson were aghast. "I think that we ought to have a little talk about giving to the daily newspapers a hint that Mr. Tesla has succeeded in taking photos by phosphorescence," Martin warned. "It will leak out some hour, and then someone with the customary arrogance will place it in the papers. We need to get our priorities established. I think R.U. Johnson feels the same way." This became the beginning of a series of disagreements between the inventor and his editor. The inventions, researches, and writings of Nikola Tesla was now in press, and Martin and Tesla were making money from the sale of the book. However, Tesla kept wanting to give copies away freely. He sent the text to each of his uncles and his 3 sisters in Bosnia, Croatia, and also mailed his article on Zmaj to his uncle Pajo and his sister Maritza. Martin had to tread carefully, for although he was unhappy with Tesla's lack of concern for the financial side of the situation, he also in no way wanted to alienate himself from the wellspring. Martin wrote, "Your request for more free copies is just too hard. It seems to me that the Pittsburgh boys, if they love you, ought to be willing to blow a little money of their own on the book. But you're the best judge of relations to them." Martin promised to send Tesla a dozen copies at reduced prices. "Perhaps," Martin requested, "you would like to make us a bid on the whole edition," closing as follows, "When you write me, make it autographic, as often as you can. People are beginning to deplete my stock." From Tesla's point of view, it was his book, and Martin should simply do as he asked. This would become a sore point, especially because Martin would come to lend Tesla money based on profits that were due him as editor, and Tesla would never repay him. Martin would overlook it, for now. After the first photographs arrived, including the discreetly stylized engraving of Tesla based on his most recent portrait, Martin requested a sneak preview. "I will lock them up or put them in a safe deposit vault, if you wish, until the hour of publication," promised Martin. "But I want to get one of the first as a historical souvenir." At the same time, Martin informed Johnson that the University of Nebraska had offered Tesla an honorary doctorate in celebration of their 25th anniversary. "I have urged him to accept. I want you and Mrs. Johnson to bring your influence on him also. Her spell is now a potent one, I fancy, with him, so far as any woman's can be, next to his sister's." It's unlikely, however, that Tesla thought much about getting a doctorate from the obscure University of Nebraska. To a person of his background and education, the offer was virtually meaningless. Johnson thought it more appropriate for a prestigious institution such as Columbia College to grant such an honor. Tesla had just received the Elliott Cresson Gold Medal Award from the Franklin Institute for his earnest and indefatigable work as a pioneer in this field, and on account of the great value to science of his researches. However, this was not the same as a doctorate, and so Johnson wrote to Huey Fairfield Osborn, one of the dignitaries at Columbia, urging that they make the offer instead. Johnson wrote, "There would be a particular appropriateness in Columbia giving him a degree, since his first lecture was, if I mistake not, delivered at the college, and since New York City is the scene of his most important discoveries, I think it may truly be said that there are few men occupying this unique position in both the theoretical and practical phases of scientific work. As to his general culture, I may say that he is widely read in the best literature of Italy, Germany, and France, as well as much of the Slavic countries, to say nothing of Greek and Latin. He is particularly fond of poetry, and is always quoting Leopardi or Goethe or the Hungarians or Russians. I know of few men of such diversity of general culture or such accuracy of knowledge." Johnson ended the letter with a character reference. "His personality," he said, "is one of distinguished sweetness, sincerity, modesty, refinement, generosity, and force." Since Professor Osborn knew Tesla well and had been witness to the Columbia lecture, he concurred with Johnson, and thereupon spoke to Seth Lowe, the president of the university. "Poulton tells me," Osborn said, "that Tesla was covered with honors while in England and France. We certainly must not allow any other university to anticipate us in honoring a man who lives under our very eyes." "Isn't he a countryman of Pupin's?" Lowe inquired. "Yes, of course. It was at the urging of Professor Pupin and Professor Crocker that Tesla spoke here to begin with." "Didn't they have a row between them?" the president responded cautiously. "I have learned confidentially that there has sprung up some slight difference between them, but I'm sure it will probably be healed. In any event, there seems little doubt that Tesla is the leading electrician in the country." Within a few weeks, the inventor was given an honorary doctorate from Columbia, and shortly thereafter he received a similar honor from Yale. Having received professional recognition among his peers, Tesla had arrived. Feature articles were appearing in prestigious periodicals, and he was hobnobbing with the most esteemed literary and social figures of the day. 14. Niagara Power, 1894. How extraordinary was my life, an incident may illustrate. As a youth, I was fascinated by a description of Niagara Falls I had perused, and pictured in my imagination a big wheel run by the falls. I told my uncle that I would go to America and carry out this scheme. 30 years later, I saw my ideas carried out at Niagara, and marveled at the unfathomable mystery of the mind. Nikola Tesla. Conquest of Niagara was by no means assured. It hinged on very specific factors. The first serious scheme to harness the mighty cataract, the Evershed Plan, was proposed in 1886. Thomas Evershed, a civil engineer who had worked on the Erie Canal, had conceived the idea of the creation of a complex network of canals and tunnels running adjacent to the falls, whereby 200 water wheels and accompanying industrial mills would be placed. He had probably ruminated over the scheme for 20 years, as Evershed had worked as a surveyor at Niagara in his youth, as far back as the 1840s. Although the idea was attractive, it was costly and dangerous to implement, as most of the 9 miles of excavation required for the canals and wheel pits had to be done by blasting through stone. Estimates ran as high as $10 million. Thus, the officials of the Cataract Construction Company sought counsel from notable engineers and inventors. In 1889, Edison submitted a plan which boldly asserted that DC could be transmitted to Buffalo approximately 20 miles away. As appreciable amounts of DC electricity had never traversed a distance in excess of 1 or 2 miles, this suggestion appeared highly optimistic, and it was doubted by most other engineers, particularly Sprague and Kennelly, 2 of Edison's co-workers. Westinghouse was also dubious of the feasibility of transmitting electrical energy, and he suggested the implementation of a sophisticated system of cables and compressed air tubes to transfer the power to Buffalo. Thus, for these reasons, plans for harnessing the falls centered for the most part on constructing an industrial complex adjacent to the falls. The long-distance transmission of electrical power was simply beyond imagining. It must be remembered that what Edison generated was meager amounts of electricity capable of illuminating light bulbs, and then only in close proximity to the source of the power. Since his DC apparatus still made use of a commutator, he was incapable of transmitting appreciable amounts of power, although he could run a few motors if they were close to the generator. That is why the 1891 Laufen-Frankfurt transmission was so startling. Brown and Dobrovolsky had not only surpassed, by a factor of about 100, Edison's long-distance record, they had also transmitted significant amounts of power, a spectacular achievement with no comparable precedent. Brown and Dobrovolsky had had predecessors. 2 years earlier, Sebastian Ziani de Ferranti, the son of an Italian musician living in Liverpool, England, had been the first to use Tesla's apparatus at a plant at Deptford. Ferranti, a brilliant engineer with talents purported to have rivaled Edison's, had already made important modifications on the Gollard-Gibbs AC apparatus for Siemens Brothers, and also Gantz and Company at their London branch. His bold idea was to create a central station along the Thames so that electricity could be pumped to numerous substations around town. In 1889, from Deptford, Ferranti transmitted an unprecedented 11,000 volts to 4 substations of 6 to 7 miles away, where 10,000 horsepower alternators were driven. This was a magnificent accomplishment, but it appears doubtful that many people understood that it was Tesla's system, or even that true success had been achieved. In no way did it gain the publicity of the Laufen-Frankfurt enterprise, nor did it spark the idea of spreading the energy of Niagara Falls beyond its surrounding area. Nor had Westinghouse's initial achievement in electrical power transmission demonstrated the capabilities of the Tesla system. He had succeeded at Telluride, Colorado, with Stilwell, Schallenberger, and Scott in transmitting 60,000 volts of AC for a distance of 4 miles to run a 100-horsepower Tesla motor, and he had illuminated the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Both of these were great triumphs, but neither demonstrated that electrical power could be transmitted over long distances. In short, without the Lauffen-Frankfurt success, there would have been no proof that AC was capable of traversing the 20 miles from Niagara to Buffalo, let alone from Niagara to New York City, which was over 300 miles away. That is why the financial backers of the Niagara project sent Edward Dean Adams, president of the Cataract Construction Company, to Europe to confer with Brown and Dobrovolsky, and that is why Dobrovolsky intimated that the invention was his. There was no physical proof to the contrary, as clearly he and Brown had been the first and only engineers to realize such a feat. Adams, from the firm Winslow, Lanier and Company out of Boston, was a slight, gentle-looking man with large round eyes, small head, the face of a teenager, and a mammoth handlebar moustache. He began his relationship with long-time J.P. Morgan associate Charles Lanier in 1881. Working his way up to full partner, Adams was placed on the board of directors of a number of major railroads, including Henry Villard's Northern Pacific and also the Ontario and Western Railroad, with lines stemming from Buffalo to New York City. He also sat on the board of directors of the Edison Electric Light Company as its second-largest stockholder. In 1889, along with Villard, who was attempting to combine all the major electric companies into one large corporation, Adams tried to curtail the highly expensive light bulb patent dispute between Edison and Westinghouse by getting them to confer with one another. But of course, Edison wanted no part of such an arrangement. As president of the Cataract Construction Company, Adams sold his shares in the Edison concern so that he could be impartial in his investigations, and in 1890 he established the International Niagara Commission with headquarters in London. His intention was to consult with leading European scientists and engineers and to examine the most advanced hydraulic power compressed air techniques, a branch of engineering in which Switzerland excelled. In 1890, Adams travelled to Europe with Dr. Coleman Sellers, another executive of the Cataract Construction Company, where they conferred with engineers in France, Switzerland and England. In London, they visited Ferranti at his electrical station at Deptford. They also met with Professor Rowland, who had travelled from Johns Hopkins University, and Gisbert Kapp, electrical engineering editor and author of the classic text Electrical Transmission of Energy. Rowland argued in favour of AC, and Kapp recommended C.E.L. Brown as the most prominent engineer to undertake the project. He was located at the Maschinen- und Fabrik Oerlikon Works in Switzerland. Adams wired J. Pierpont Morgan, who was in Paris, with the suggestion that he return to Switzerland to meet with Brown. Morgan concurred. Before leaving England, Adams met with Sir William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, whom he placed in charge of the International Niagara Commission, and a contest was created awarding cash prizes totaling $20,000 for the best plans submitted for harnessing the falls. L.B. Stilwell, who was in London with H.H. Bilsby at the Westinghouse branch, wired to Pittsburgh to request permission to compete by giving Adams a plan based on the Tesla system. But Westinghouse turned down the idea because he didn't want to give away $100,000 worth of advice for such a paltry sum. Of the 20 proposals submitted, most involved compressed air and hydraulic equipment. Of the 6 electrical plans, 4 used direct current. 1 proposed single-phase AC, but details were not fully described. The remaining plan, by Professor George Forbes, advocated polyphase installation. Forbes, who was a professor from Glasgow and who was later hired as consulting engineer to the Niagara Power Company, wrote to the Commission, "It will be somewhat startling to many, as I confess it was at first to myself, to find as the result of a thorough and impartial examination of the problem that the only practical solution lies in the adoption of alternating current generators and motors. The only workable one is the Tesla motor manufactured by the Westinghouse Electric Company, and which I have myself put through various tests at their works at Pittsburgh." Although initially rejected by the Commission, the Forbes report caught the eye of Adams. Nevertheless, Adams went to Switzerland to confer with C.E.L. Brown, who declined the offers to head up the Niagara project. Morgan's emissary was Francis Lynn Stetson, a lawyer who was also part of the Cataract Construction Company. He was sent to Switzerland and London to review the prevailing technology for their company GE, but it was starting to become obvious that the major patents were all owned by Westinghouse. In Tivoli, where there were waterfalls 334 feet high, Gans and Company of Budapest, another Westinghouse-linked operation, was constructing a hydroelectric plant to transmit electricity to Rome, which was 18 miles away. And in Portland, Oregon, at Willamette Falls, Westinghouse was also transmitting thousands of volts of AC over distances of 12 miles. Although Kelvin sided with Edison in insisting that DC was superior, Adams now knew that Westinghouse held all the trump cards. In America, however, and from the point of view of GE, the outcome was not all that obvious. The panic of 1893 had taken its toll, and Charles Coffin, CEO of GE, was forced to ruthlessly lay off a large number of their workers and cut the pay of many others. Not only had production of electrical equipment fallen dramatically, infighting between the Edison and Thomson camps peaked. Although Thomson and Steinmetz now realized that AC was vastly superior to DC, they were unable to guarantee to Coffin that they could devise equipment superior to Tesla's. Desperate to compete, it appears that a memorandum was sent by Thomson to E.G. Waters, general manager of the GE plant in Pittsburgh, for the purpose of recruiting an informant who worked for Westinghouse. Noticing that blueprints were missing, Westinghouse accused GE of industrial espionage, and charges were brought against Thomson's Lynn plant, where a sheriff, acting under court orders, found the missing documents. The GE officials claimed that their interest was in seeing whether Westinghouse was pirating their protected light bulbs, and the jury split 6-6 on the decision. Westinghouse suspected that a janitor was the true culprit, but the man was never prosecuted. Simultaneously, Steinmetz and Thomson were submitting patent applications for an AC motor which used a teaser current instead of a full-fledged polyphase one, but it was obvious to the Patent Office that the apparatus was based on the Tesla system, and their patent application was denied. This did not stop Thomson from insisting that he was the real inventor of the AC system, and by 1894, with Thomson's great expertise, he devised an induction motor that in some respects was superior to the one produced by Westinghouse. Ironically, even to this day, biographies of Elihu Thomson often accuse Tesla of the piracy instead of the reverse. Although GE was brought to trial for stealing blueprints, they audaciously continued for the next several years, through Waters, to pay spies to obtain information from the Westinghouse plant. Nevertheless, Westinghouse's success at Telluride and at the Chicago World's Fair eliminated any remaining doubts as to who would be awarded the Niagara contract. In the first months of 1893, Forbes, Rowland, and Sellers visited Pittsburgh to test their equipment, and in May of that year the deal was signed with Westinghouse. As J. Pierpont Morgan was the major force behind GE, it's interesting to speculate about why he allowed Westinghouse to gain the bid. First of all, when the actual contract was signed, because the operation was so enormous, and because of Morgan's ties to GE, a large portion of the work was also given to GE. Westinghouse constructed the generators, switchgear, and auxiliary equipment in the powerhouse, and GE was awarded contracts for the transformers, the transmission line to Buffalo, and the equipment for the substation there. Thus, although Westinghouse got the larger share, GE was by no means cut out, and in fact ended up with a licensing arrangement which gave them their first legal foothold on the fundamental patents held by the other company. Morgan had close ties to August Belmont, who was one of Westinghouse's financial backers, and it's possible that this connection had something to do with the arrangement. He acquiesced in part because of his respect for the commission Adams had set up, and also because of the advice he received from his lawyer, William B. Rankin, who lived in Buffalo and who had devoted his life to the enterprise, and his close associate, Francis Lynn Stetson, who told Morgan of Tesla's daring promise as far back as 1890 to place 100,000 horsepower on a wire and send it 450 miles in one direction to New York City, the metropolis of the East, and 500 miles in the other direction to Chicago, the metropolis of the West, to serve the purpose of these great urban communities. In 1894, Tesla hit his stride. The Martin article in the Century opened the floodgates, and an army of reporters from newspapers and magazines descended upon him. That year would find features on Tesla in such prestigious periodicals as New Science Review, Outlook, and Cassius. McClure's and Review of Reviews boldly announced that Tesla was the founder of the discoveries which lay behind the largest electrical enterprise in the world, and the New York Times profiled him in a 4-column spread, complete with a large stylized portrait and an in-depth account of his philosophies and newest creations. The following year, the Times wrote, "To Tesla belongs the undisputed honor of being the man whose work made this Niagara enterprise possible. There could be no better evidence of the practical qualities of his inventive genius." Since the contracts with Westinghouse and GE had been signed, Adams no longer had to pretend to be unbiased. Now he was free to seek business ventures. He came down to New York to visit Tesla at his laboratory, and there Adams was introduced to the inventor's new mechanical and electrical oscillators and to a revolutionary new AC system of lighting that was vastly superior to the existing one. Adams offered Tesla $100,000 for a controlling interest in 14 U.S. patents, many foreign patents, and any future inventions which Tesla might conceive. The inventor accepted the proposal. In February 1895, the creation of the Nikola Tesla Company was formally announced, with the directors being Tesla, Alfred S. Brown of New York, Charles Coney of New Jersey, William B. Rankin of Buffalo, Edward D. Adams, and Adams' son, Ernest of Boston. Tesla had reached the inner sanctum of the corporate world. He now had on his board 2 of the most important members of the Niagara Project, and he was sitting on at least a half-dozen entirely new inventions, each of which had the potential for creating completely new industries. His mechanical oscillators looked as if they were going to replace the steam engine. His electrical oscillators were intrinsic to his system of fluorescent lighting, remote control, and his now secret work in wireless transmission. And there were other ideas as well, such as his work in artificial intelligence, ozone production, cheap refrigeration, and cheap manufacture of liquid air, the manufacture of fertilizers and nitric acid from the air. However, all of these inventions were still, to a great extent, in their developmental stages, and Tesla's strong suit was never in manufacturing. He gained his backers ostensibly because of his track record in AC, and because of the promise held by his cold light and various oscillators. But his real interest, his passion, remained in the wireless transmission of power, and most of his time was spent in that direction. 15. Effulgent Glory, 1894. Dear Mr. Tesla, early in 1894, I told our mutual friend, T.C. Martin, that your book, The Inventions, Researches, and Writings of Nikola Tesla, would still be considered a classic 100 years hence. I have not changed my opinion. The application of the principles therein first enunciated have definitely changed for the better life on this planet. D. McFarlane Moore. In February 1894, Tesla went with T.C. Martin to the laboratory of Mr. Bettini, an inventor who had advanced Edison's work in the perfection of the phonograph. He wants to display his marvelous collection of song cylinders, Madame Melba, Dereshki, Salvini, and Bernhardt. Martin wrote, he wishes the honor of catching your voice as well. During this time, Martin continued to forward reviews from Book News, Physics Review, and London Electrician. Praise from Sir Herbert Spencer is praise indeed, the editor wrote. Thanks for continuing the Russian translation. The German edition is selling as well. On the home front, Tesla had formed a new company with 2 of the coordinators of the Niagara Project, and he was now turning his attention to designing a wireless system that would be able to transmit light, information, and electrical power. Thus the inventor worked to perfect his mechanical and electrical oscillators and vacuum lamps. The mechanical oscillator could efficiently convert steam to electrical power. The electrical oscillator could produce the frequencies necessary for power transmission, and the wireless fluorescent bulbs could be illuminated when the correct wavelengths were reached capable of engendering light. According to Tesla's theory, if the ether could be made to oscillate at 500 trillion times per second, pure light would be created. Below that figure, heat was produced. T.C. Martin continued to play a role somewhat like a manager. In the spring, he set up a sitting for the inventor before the sculptor, Mr. Wood. And to Tesla's dismay, he also arranged an interview with S.S. McClure, the well-known magazine editor. Tesla had too many events crammed into his calendar, but T.C. persisted. "I cannot very well call off McClure now," Martin wrote, "after your little dinner, which has simply made him more eager than ever for the article." Ending the missive with customary praise, Martin wrote, "He knows now personally what he knew before only by hearsay, viz., that you are a great man and a nice fellow. I excuse your blushes." It would take nearly a year for the Century to complete its own article and organize the photographing of the celebrated individuals who came to 33 to 35 South Fifth Avenue, but finally, in April 1895, Martin's follow-up piece appeared. Even today, a century later, it remains a spectacular testament to the wizard's fabled laboratory, for not only did it display many fascinating inventions and prognostications, it also presented dazzling multiple-exposure photographs of such stars of the day as actor Joseph Jefferson, poet F. Marion Crawford, and sorcerer Nikola Tesla. "Martin's article should be read very carefully to be appreciated," Tesla wrote Johnson. With 35 homes illuminated by gas, by everyone lit by electricity, the market was ripe for a more efficient source. However, Tesla's fluorescent lamps were still in an experimental stage, as evidenced by the 10-minute time-lapse photograph of Mark Twain taken for the Martin article. The story for Tesla's steam dynamo was analogous. According to Martin's figures, 9/10 of all dynamos in the country were steam-driven. The rest gained their power from either compressed air, water wheels, or gasoline. Since the Tesla oscillator was 40 times more efficient than the prevailing steam-driven dynamo, it seemed that the marketing of this product would be highly profitable. But again, the perfection of the device was not completed, and therefore not yet marketable. Nevertheless, it was revolutionary, and Tesla contacted Babcock and Wilcox to begin manufacturing prototypes. Before a large number of physicians and engineers of the American Electrotherapeutic Association at his laboratory in October 1894, Tesla used the oscillator to generate electricity for over 50 incandescent lamps and vacuum tubes. Also, arc lights were shown in operation. Naturally, the oscillator also generated the extremely high frequencies necessary for engendering beneficial electrotherapeutic effects. Refining his theory on wireless communication, the inventor realized that electrical energy could be transmitted in two distinctly different ways, one as radiation through the air and the other as conduction through the ground. Today, this difference corresponds to FM and AM radio. As an experiment to verify that FM travels mostly through the air and AM mostly through or along the ground, drive your car into an underpass and turn on the radio. When you switch on AM, amplitude modulation, you will probably hear static, whereas FM, frequency modulation, comes in loud and clear. "When I showed my experiments to an audience," Tesla said, "it would happen that when I wanted to operate single circuits with some devices, more than one circuit would respond, and people would call my attention to this. I would then have to say that the circuits were not carefully tuned." Thus the inventor turned his attention to the problem of creating separate channels. By studying Herbert Spencer's theories on resultant forces and nerve conduction, Tesla began to realize that he could design vacuum tubes which would respond only when a precise combination of two or more circuits were being triggered. One of the lamps held by Twain was illuminated in this manner, its dual circuit triggered by a corresponding dual circuit created by two cables laid around the room. Like the combination of a safety lock, this invention not only explains the mechanism behind tuning into different stations on the radio, it also explains the principle behind telephone and TV scramblers. In this way, Tesla attained the exclusiveness and non-interferability of impulses. Transmitting messages from an outer circuit to an inner circuit 20 feet away was one thing. Sending information over long distances was another matter entirely. Tesla had realized for a number of years that the Earth carried a charge, and therefore he decided to utilize the planet itself as a carrier of electrical energy. If this was so, and individualized channels could be created, transmission lines appeared to be superfluous. He therefore began to construct many different-sized coils to connect to the ground, usually via the water main system, in order to ascertain the terrestrial period of frequency. With an oscillator constructed for this purpose, Martin wrote, "If he has not yet actually determined the Earth's precise electrical charge or capacity, he has obtained striking effects which conclusively demonstrate that he has succeeded in disturbing it. When his oscillations are in harmony with the individual vibrations of the Earth, an intense vibration or surging will be obtained." Martin ended the article with the suggestion that with this device not only could information and power be transmitted, but also the weather might be modified. "Perchance we shall call up Mars in this way some day, the electrical charge of both planets being utilized as signals," Martin concluded, quoting Tesla's wish at the finale of the exposé. Classifying Tesla was becoming more and more difficult. Martin portrayed him in a variety of ways, as a practical inventor, a wizard, and an iconoclast. Critics portrayed him as an impractical, visionary enthusiast. "His inventions already show how brilliantly capable he is," one newspaper reported, "but his propositions seem like a madman's dream of empire." One is naturally disappointed that nothing practical has as yet proceeded from the magnificent experimental investigations with which Tesla has dazzled the world, Lieutenant F. Jarvis Patton wrote in Electrical World. But his solid accomplishments at Niagara could not be ignored. The article concluded, "Before the general public, he stands as a phenomenal inventor from the Eastern world, from whom is expected little less than if he carried Aladdin's lamp in his hand, which, of course, is wrong, and an injustice both to the public and to Mr. Tesla. He has doubtless much importance in store for us, but the difference should never be lost sight of between the search for nature's truths in the lab of the physicist and the reduction of the results attained, however great their promise, to a form suitable for commercial use. If some of the dreams which Tesla and others are cherishing today ever come to realization, the magnitude of the ensuing change in the material life of the world simply defies the imagination." In Manhattan, Tesla soon caught the eye of Joseph Pulitzer, the German-Hungarian immigrant and owner of the New York World. Pulitzer sent his newest reporter, Arthur Brisbane, on the interview. Already one of the most widely read columnists in the nation, Brisbane had recently jumped from Charles Dana's New York Sun, but at age 30, Brisbane would soon also leave Pulitzer to become head shock reporter for William Randolph Hearst's up-and-coming Yellow Journal. He met Tesla in July 1894. While dining nightly at Delmonico's restaurant, the reporter was introduced by Mr. Delmonico to a very handsome young man with a pointed black beard. Brisbane wrote that Mr. Delmonico lowers his voice when he speaks of Mr. Tesla, as Boston cab drivers used to lower their voices in speaking of John L. Sullivan. That Mr. Tesla can do anything, Delmonico contended. We managed to make him play pool one night. He had never played, but he had watched us for a little while. He was very indignant when he found that we meant to give him 15 points, but it didn't matter much, for he beat us all and got all the money. Delmonico noted that they were only playing for quarters, but it wasn't the money we cared about, but the way he studies out pool in his head and then beat us after we had practiced for years. It surprised us. Considering that Tesla was very proficient at the sport and had slyly kept that information confidential, makes the story all the more interesting. Tesla could be deceptive, particularly in pecuniary matters. Although the article appeared somewhat disjointed and redundant, it nevertheless aptly described Tesla's habits and appearance at that time. Tesla would dine frequently at the popular establishment, always choosing a table by the window and usually reading a newspaper. Brisbane described Tesla's eyes as being set very far back in his head, and they're rather light. I asked him how that could be, as he was a Slav. He told me that his eyes were once much darker, but that using his mind a great deal had made them many shades lighter. This confirmed a theory on brain usage and eye colour that Brisbane had heard about. Brisbane went on to write that Tesla stoops. Most men do when they have no peacock blood in them. He lives inside of himself. And yet the article was adorned with the most fantastic full-body engraving of Tesla, standing quite unstooped, proud as a peacock, illuminated like a virtual Christmas tree. This full-page spread remains one of the most spectacular portraits of the inventor ever concocted, and it caused numerous people to ask Tesla how it felt to pump such huge amounts of electricity throughout his body. "I admit that I was somewhat alarmed when I began these experiments," Tesla admitted. "But after I understood the principles, I could proceed in an unalarmed manner." When pressed for details, a number of years later at the Harvard Club, the inventor responded, "When the body of a person is subjected to the rapidly alternating pressure of an electrical oscillator of 2½ million volts, this presents a sight marvelous and unforgettable. One sees the experimenter standing on a big sheet of fierce, blinding flame, his whole body enveloped in a mass of phosphorescent streamers like the tentacles of an octopus. Bundles of light stick out from his spine. As he stretches out the arms, roaring tongues of fire leap from his fingertips as myriads of minute projectiles are shot off from him with such velocities as to pass through the adjoining walls. He is in turn being violently bombarded by the surrounding air and dust." Tesla was walking a difficult line and revealing contradictory natures, reclusive versus natural showman. The interest of the press made it difficult to protect against piracy. He wanted to disclose for public and historical purposes his overall goal, but he had to keep vital details confidential. One reporter who had spent a day with this kindly wizard of Washington Square revealed that Tesla confided to me that he was engaged on several secret experiments of most abundant promise, but their nature cannot be hinted at here. However, I have Mr. Tesla's permission to say that someday he proposes to transmit vibrations through the earth so that it will be possible to send a message from an ocean steamer to a city, however distant, without the use of any wire. Even his laboratory workers were insulated from the details of his secret experiments. After calculating the size of the planet and the hypothetical wavelength of solar rays, Tesla constructed a transmitter with several circuits capable of engendering their electrical charge into the earth. One end of the instrument was attached to the ground via the radiator or water main, and the other end was connected to a cable which Tesla brought to the roof of the building as an aerial connection. With Mr. Dias Buitrago, his draftsman, in charge of the transmitter, the inventor would take his receiving instruments as far as 5 miles away. His first experiments were set up on the roof of the Hotel Gerlach, approximately 30 blocks from the lab. With balloons filled with hot air, helium or hydrogen to hold the elevated terminal aerial high above the buildings, and a cable attached to the water main of the hotel, Tesla set up his receivers and verified that indeed electrical energy could be secured from his transmitter. Had Tesla taken a reporter with him on any one of these excursions, it is quite possible that the generally accepted history of the invention of wireless transmission would be completely different, because in all of Tesla's years he never demonstrated before a viewing body any long-distance wireless effects. Still 3 years away from expressing details of his wireless work in patent applications, Tesla had actually hidden some of his plans in patents already secured on his mechanical and electrical oscillators drawn up in 1891 and 1893. This would present a problem for Mikhail Pupin, who was also experimenting with resonance effects and the transmission of simultaneous messages. However, Pupin's goal involved the improvement of the prevailing telephone and telegraph lines. He was not attempting to send messages without them. Pupin realized that by equally spacing pulsations of AC, the rapidity and number of transmissions could be increased greatly. Unfortunately, his February 1894 patent prospectus was easily covered in Tesla's existing inventions and high-frequency lectures. Tesla had announced in London in February 1892 that if the wavelength of the impulses is much smaller than the length of the wire, then corresponding short waves would greatly reduce the capacity, making it possible to send over the wire high-frequency currents at enormous distances. Furthermore, the character of the vibrations would not be greatly affected. The creation of a screen to cut the wire into smaller sections would make it possible to transmit many telephonic messages over the transatlantic cable. These patents and published announcements in no way deterred Pupin. He felt that he had discovered something, and he began a long campaign against the U.S. Patent Office in an attempt to bulldoze his way into a legal foothold. The prize, if successful, would be enormous, as he would have exclusive rights on a way to successfully transmit at the same time large numbers of non-interfering long-distance telephonic and telegraphic conversations over the same wires. Pupin's nemesis was John Seymour, Commissioner of Patents. The Columbia University professor's first strategy was to write up a patent application. He submitted it on February the 10th, 1894, claiming, "I certainly consider myself the first to make a practical application of this principle to multiple telegraphy." Seymour's reply a few months later was that Pupin's claims are rejected on the arrangement of apparatus shown, by patents by Thomson and Rice, and by Tesla's article, Experiments in Alternating Currents. Seymour also cited the exact page and figure number, concluding that Pupin had merely multiplied Mr. Tesla's electric light circuits, which in no way was a new invention. Hiring a lawyer to help him put together a legalistic-looking circular, Pupin argued that he had indeed been the inventor of the art of distributing electrical energy by alternating currents. The typeset brief, which resembled an official court document, read in part as follows: Tesla produced luminous effects and did not consider multiplex signaling. He does not disclose several exciting circuits acting on the main line, which means for tuning each exciting circuit independently. The applicant was the first to apply the principle upon which the claims are based, and did more than merely multiply the Tesla electric circuit. Seymour wrote back, "Claims 1, 2, and 3 are again rejected on Tesla. It is well known in the art that several periodicities may be simultaneously impressed on the same line. The examiner can see no more in these claims than a multiplication of Tesla's circuit in a manner well understood in the art." Pupin was adamant. He was convinced that he had been the first to invent the obvious, and furthermore that he had a total right to make use of Tesla's oscillators, as they were now being generally accepted as the optimum frequency generators for long-distance electrical transmissions. By studying each rejection notice by the U.S. Patent Office, Pupin kept refining the language of his patent in order to try and come upon a way that would secure a legal foothold for him. Moreover, Pupin continued to convince himself that indeed this invention was his. Altering history in his mind and erasing Tesla in his classroom, Pupin would continue his battle to secure this highly lucrative patent on the means of transmitting many simultaneous messages over long distances. His battle would continue for another 6 years, until after John Seymour retired. The year 1894 was a banner one. In July, the spectacular portrait of Tesla appeared in the World. He had major coverage in Electrical World, the New York Times, and Review of Reviews, and his AC polyphase system was going to be utilized at Niagara Falls. Tesla had formed a partnership with financiers from Wall Street. He had invited the historical giants of his age to his workplace, and he had made marked improvements in experiments in wireless communication. The year closed with an invitation by Tesla to the Johnsons to come to his shop. "Dear Luca," Tesla wrote on December the 21st, "you have not forgotten the visit to my laboratory tomorrow, I hope. Dvorak will be there, and a number of other celebrities in America's elite." Antonin Dvorak, 15 years Tesla's senior, had immigrated from his native Czechoslovakia in 1892 to be appointed director of the National Conservatory of Music. Forever homesick, Dvorak stayed in the United States for only 3 years, but during that time he composed some of his most famous works, particularly the New World Symphony. After the performance, Dvorak visited the Wizard's lab. Christmas and New Year's Eve with the Johnsons would round out one truly remarkable year.
This audiobook has been broken into multiple parts to make the download faster. You have reached the end of a part, but not the end of the complete audiobook. So please check your library for the next part of this audiobook.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.
This is Audible.
Wizard: The Life and Times of Nikola Tesla. Biography of a Genius. By Mark J. Cypher. 16. Fire at the Lab, 1895. The destruction of Nikola Tesla's workshop with its wonderful contents is something more than a private calamity. It is a misfortune to the whole world. It is not any degree an exaggeration to say that the men living at this time who are more important to the human race than this young gentleman can be counted on the fingers of one hand, perhaps on the thumb of one hand. Charles Dana. It was one fine Sunday afternoon in 1894, as Tesla was strolling up Fifth Avenue with 25-year-old D. McFarlane Moore, a colleague of great promise in the field of fluorescent lighting, when the Serbian savant deliberately stopped and pensively proclaimed, "Moore, after we have signaled from any point to any point on the Earth, the next step will be signaling to other planets." Before the inventor could undertake such an enormous task, he first had to perfect wireless effects over long distances on the Earth. One of his plans was to send messages from his laboratory to receiving equipment which he was going to place on a Hudson River steamboat. Unfortunately, on March the 13th, 1895, Tesla's laboratory burned to the ground. The whole floor collapsed and equipment dropped to the second floor. For one fleeting moment, the civilized world was in shock, for the demolition of the maestro's atelier was a tragedy of incalculable proportions. Fortunately, Tesla was not injured, for he was asleep in his hotel at the time. 2 tottering brick walls and the yawning jaws of a sombre cavity aswim with black water and oil were all that could be seen that fateful morning, of a laboratory which to all who had visited it was one of the most interesting spots on earth. This coming great man, current literature noted, who lives his life as in a dream, forgetful of the lapse of time and living only for the future, was about to revolutionize the cost and economies of electric lighting and place it within the reach of the humblest and poorest of people. To have all of his innumerable marvels swept away at one stroke is a calamity to the whole world as well as to himself. Perhaps, in part to help cheer Tesla up, and in honor of the Serbian-American pioneer of electrical communication, the Postal Telegraph Union of Serbia caused a sensation by connecting a simultaneous concert in Belgrade and Niš by telephone, so that both audiences could hear it. The Tesla laboratory was, in a sense, a private museum, T.C. Martin wrote. The owner kept in it many souvenirs of bygone toil and experiment. After describing in detail its contents, Martin concluded, "Perhaps the most painful loss of all is the destruction of Mr. Tesla's notes and papers. His memory is all right, and flashes on any experiment of the past with the revealing power of a searchlight, but the time it will take for the inventor to recreate his ongoing investigations will also cost other experimenters years of sweat and pain. Nevertheless, while the ashes of his hopes lay hot, Tesla was at work again with clenched determination." The strain was enormous, and Tesla steeled himself to fight off depression. One paper reported that he suffered a physical collapse. To help keep his spirits up, Martin met with the inventor at a local cafe to give him more free copies of their book. He may have also given him money. "Here it please your Majesty," the editor said with a bow. Your experiments have been repeated in Berlin under your name with the Emperor's brother, Prince Henry, assisting. If you did not get a daily bolster from me, you would have a relapse into dullness, as you do when you miss your daily dose of electricity." The duo sat down to review Martin's article on the burning of the lab, so that a more accurate description of its lost contents could be enumerated. Westinghouse was still in the midst of battling William Stanley of the William Stanley Company and Elihu Thomson of GE in patent litigation, as each was continuing to produce AC induction motors illegally, while at the same time implying that the invention was of their own design. Together, these two concerns outsold Westinghouse by 10,000 kilowatts for the period 1893 to 97. According to some, their motors and generators were more efficient. Stanley, who continued to brazenly promulgate the sale of his polyphase system in advertisements in the electrical journals, had by this time increased his operation from 15 men to a few hundred, and GE was more than twice that size. Embroiled in the numerous patent disputes, the Westinghouse Company decided to take out a full-page advertisement which proclaimed, "Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, sole owners of the Tesla polyphase system." The display continued, "The novelty of Mr. Tesla's inventions was recognized by Professor Elihu Thomson, who said in discussing the Tesla inventions before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in 1888, 'I have certainly been very much interested in the description given by Mr. Tesla of his new and admirable little motor. I have, as probably you may be aware, worked in somewhat similar directions and towards similar ends. The trials which I have made have been by the use of a single alternating current circuit, not a double alternating circuit." Although GE intimated that the Tesla motor was dangerous because it gave off too many sparks, there is no evidence that the fire in Tesla's lab was caused by his equipment. It had started in the floor below in a dry cleaning establishment. Some investigators intimated that a careless night watchman may have been responsible, perhaps by smoking near oily rags. Estimates of the uninsured loss ranged as high as $1 million, but the actual damage was probably closer to $250,000. O'Neill suggests that Adams came to the rescue by advancing $40,000 in return for a piece of the company. However, Adams was already a partner, and thus he, Tesla, and the other partners all suffered losses. Still, there is some evidence that Adams did provide further assistance at this time. Royalties from Europe and continuing modest annual payments from the Westinghouse Company helped offset the misfortune, but clearly Tesla now needed to raise additional revenue in order to open up a new place. In particular, Tesla received a number of letters from friendly members of the Westinghouse Company. Ernest Heinrich, an engineer and author, wrote, "I hasten to offer you my sincere regret." Not knowing the situation, he continued, "I trust that you were well insured and will be able very soon to find another suitable location to carry on your work." Tesla was uninsured, but he had generated too much momentum to slow his progress. Within a few days, he was out scouting new locations. In the interim, he turned to the one lab where he knew vital equipment would be on hand. For the next few weeks, Nikola Tesla rolled up his sleeves at Tom Edison's workshop at Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, a laboratory that shuts out everybody who has not been given a pass by Mr. Edison himself or one of his assistants. Simultaneously, he contacted Albert Schmidt for more equipment, scoffing, as was his nature, at any expense which might be incurred. "I shall rely as to the price entirely on the fairness of the Westinghouse Company," Tesla said, concluding, "I believe that there are gentlemen in that company who believe in a hereafter." Vice President and General Manager Samuel Bannister shipped as a gift some early Tesla models which had been saved from the World's Fair, and wrote of his regret concerning "your misfortune." "I am glad to know that you took off your coat to work to get everything back into shape as soon as possible." However, this was little consolation, as the Westinghouse Company would begin to bill Tesla for the cost of machinery lost in the fire which was on loan. They also charged him for new equipment. In April, partly in response to Brisbane's announcement that Tesla was greater even than Edison, the rivalry between the two men, at least in the press, intensified. "Who is king, Edison or Tesla?" the Troy Press of New York inquired. Joseph Jefferson, speaking in Boston, left no doubt about his position. "Edison has been deposed," the thespian proclaimed, "and Tesla has been coronated new potentate." The twin wizards of electricity met in May in Philadelphia, along with Alexander Graham Bell, at the National Electrical Exposition. For the first time ever, Tesla's AC was transmitted the grand distance of 500 miles. Tesla was disappointed that no appreciable amount of power was transported along the existing telephone lines for fear by the underwriters that damage or a fire could result. Nevertheless, the experiment was a complete success and dwarfed the achievements of the old 100-mile Laufen-Frankfurt record. "The most amazing thing at this exposition," Edison remarked, "is the demonstration of the ability to deliver here an electric current generated at Niagara Falls. To my mind, it solves one of the most important questions associated with electrical development." Bell concurred, stating, "This long-distance transmission of electric power was the most important discovery of electric science that had been made for many years." Bell, with Edison looking into the future, realized that by means of this discovery, cities and towns remote from the places of electrical generation would be able to obtain the services of this agent with great economy and with a practical convenience far superior than is now possible. Tesla, who solved the problem, stated, "I am now convinced beyond any question that it is possible to transmit electricity by water power to commercial advantage over a distance of 500 miles at half the cost of generation by steam or coal. I am willing to stake my reputation and my life upon this declaration." No record exists of what was said between Tesla and Edison on this occasion, but it seems likely that each was privately amused by the rivalry played out in the press, that Tesla thanked Edison for the temporary use of his laboratory, and that Edison expressed his condolences for the loss of Tesla's workplace. GE was now losing the propaganda campaign on all fronts. Even Edison was admitting Tesla's accomplishment. Rumors began to circulate that an agreement with Westinghouse was reached on the pooling of patents, but a total solution was a number of years away, partly because GE had so many divisions that were pirating the apparatus, and partly because Westinghouse saw no immediate advantage in making a deal. After one significant loss in the courts, the headquarters of GE were forced to abandon its position, but they would continue to bargain because their financiers controlled the Niagara enterprise. Moreover, the size of that venture prevented Westinghouse from tackling it alone. T.C. Martin, however, naively thought that a complete reconciliation and vindication for Tesla was at hand. "This would now mean the acknowledgement of supremacy of your polyphase patents," he wrote. "I suppose each will license the other." It does not appear that Tesla enlightened him on the finality of the deal he had signed, because 1 full year later the editor discussed the subject again. "I cannot tell you how pleased I am about the news of the recognition of your patents by GE Company, and I hasten to congratulate you. This ought to fill your pockets with your own money," Martin concluded. At least from a historical perspective, vindication was at hand, for now it was accepted even by the opposition that Tesla's work alone was making possible the yoking into service of old Niagara herself. But the inventor would never reap any financial gains other than those he had already settled for. "This discovery forms the basis," Review of Reviews announced, "of the Niagara Company's attempt to utilize that enormous power which for centuries has been running to waste, and thus to turn machinery in towns and cities so far away as Buffalo, 20 miles distant, and perhaps New York and Chicago." And then the magazine dropped the bombshell. "And it underlies the hardly less bold venture of the Westinghouse and Baldwin companies to drive a through railway express by electricity. It is not too much to say that the Tesla motor is behind all the large attempts at power transmission by electricity which are being made throughout the country, not only in the fields of manufacture and transportation, but also in mining, irrigation, and farming. August the 7th, 1895. My dear Mr. Westinghouse, I learned from the journals of your friendly agreement with the Baldwin Locomotive Works. The news of your consolidation has been an agreeable surprise. Such a splendid union of means and abilities cannot fail to be of interest to both parties concerned. Yours very truly, N. Tesla. Tesla was in need of new capital. The Westinghouse Corporation was billing him for lost equipment and for new machines ordered, and yet they had just gained 2 gargantuan contracts in 2 entirely separate fields, both based on his creation. Surely the corporation would overlook a few $1,000s owed, especially when it was Tesla's personality that played a key role in gathering such principals of the Niagara Company as Edward Dean Adams, John Jacob Astor, and William Birch Rankin into the fold. It also occurred to the inventor that use of his induction motor in an entirely novel field, such as railway transportation, was, in a sense, outside the original intent of their contract. Should not he also benefit from such a fortuitous turn of events? Tesla would continue somewhat naively to bring new potential clients to Pittsburgh, almost as if he were their private ambassador, but he would never receive additional compensation for the service. 17. Martian Fever, 1895–96. If there are intelligent inhabitants of Mars or any other planet, it seems to me that we can do something to attract their attention. I have had this scheme under consideration for 5 or 6 years. Nikola Tesla. John Jacob Astor III graduated from Harvard University at the age of 22 in 1888. He was one of the wealthiest men on the planet, with assets in the neighborhood of $100 million. By comparison, J. Pierpont Morgan's wealth was perhaps $30 million. As a youth, Astor had been an inventor, having patented a bicycle brake and a pneumatic walkway, which won a prize at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Other inventions included a storage battery, an internal combustion engine, and a flying machine. During his college years, when he was known by the unfortunate nickname of Jackass, Astor, who now sported long tapered sideburns and a waxed moustache, had undertaken courses with the inimitable astronomy professor William Pickering. One of Astor's pet projects was to find a way to create rain by pumping warm, moist air from the Earth's surface into the upper atmosphere. But the U.S. Patent Office had turned him down. Thus, when Pickering mentioned that the seasons were due to the inclination of the Earth's axis off of the ecliptic, Astor became intrigued. If the Earth were not tilted away from the Sun, Pickering suggested, it would probably have one uniform moderate climate, even at the extreme north and south latitudes. As part of the curriculum, Astor was introduced to the Harvard Observatory. There, along with such up-and-comers as Percival Lowell, brother of the president of the university, Astor could peer through the great telescope and view such wonders as the craters on the Moon, the satellites of Jupiter, and Saturn's spectacular rings. In April 1890, Professor Pickering made headlines when he photographed what he said was a snowstorm on the planet Mars. He calculated that the area covered was almost equal to that of the United States. 2 years later, during a celebrated trip to Harvard's observatory in Arequipa, Peru, the bushily bearded professor announced another major discovery: lakes in great numbers on Mars. The canals, Pickering proclaimed, have dark as well as bright regions. We also observed clouds and the melting of snows, and this confirmed Herschel's hypothesis that there was vegetation around the regions of water. The idea of attempting to signal Martians, as they were then called, was a familiar ambition of the day, and Astor, like Tesla, was caught in the fancy of it. In 1894, Percival Lowell announced in Nature his description of the canals of Mars. At the same time, Astor, just 30 years old, completed a science fiction novel about space travel. Entitled A Journey in Other Worlds, his book offered a futuristic vision of what takes place 1 century into the future. A few months after publication, in February 1895, the financier presented a copy to the great inventor. Although Tesla did not appear to be particularly impressed by the work, the inventor promised Astor to keep it as an interesting and pleasant memento of our acquaintance. Adorned with ethereal outer space illustrations by Dan Beard, Astor's tale begins in the year 2000 with a meeting at Delmonico's restaurant of the Terrestrial Axis Straightening Company, whose task it is to create fair weather throughout the planet. Astor envisions, for the close of the 20th century, a picture telephone, an airplane with the ability to fly to Europe in one day, an electric automobile, hidden phonographs by the police to record conversations of criminals, color photography, a rain-making device, the idea of colonizing the solar system, and the understanding that the Earth would appear like a crescent moon when seen from outer space. Perhaps Astor's most impressive prediction is the path that his spaceship, Callisto, takes on its journey to Jupiter. Astor hypothesizes that just as magnetism has a repelling force, gravity should as well. This energy, which he called apogee, is simply the opposite of gravity. By harnessing apogee, the astronauts in the story aim their ship first toward the Sun, then change their course to something like a tangent to the Earth, and receive their final right direction back out toward Jupiter in swinging near the Moon. To bring apogee into play. Exactly a century after this book appeared, NASA actually did send a spacecraft, named the Galileo, on a voyage along a remarkably similar trajectory, using Venus instead of the Moon as the pivot for the swing back out toward Jupiter. Whereas this modern trip will take a few years, Astor's weary travelers cover the distance in a matter of days. Jupiter is abundant with life. Flowers greet them by singing with the volume of a cathedral organ. The red spot, they find out, was caused by a forest changing color due to a cold snap. Armed, the astronauts are able to hunt down animals resembling mastodons, which they kill for food. Fortunately, they also have the wherewithal to hop back onto the Callisto so they can return to Earth. Fueled by a competitive spirit, the newspapers and magazines continued to promulgate the idea that Mars was inhabited by beings possibly more intelligent than we. As Tesla made headlines in the New York dailies and electrical journals for his bold prediction that he would signal the stars, and Astor made the bookstores with his space-traveling romance of the future, other luminaries were also capitalizing on the extraterrestrial fervor. In 1895, George Lathrop, son-in-law of novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, had Earthlings battle warriors from the Red Planet on the pages of the New York Journal. Their weapons were disintegrating death rays invented by the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Edison. The following year, George du Maurier, grandfather of Daphne, wrote the novel The Martian, in which he describes telepathic winged beings that descend from no monkey, but are able to adorn marble statues and irrigate the entire planet. And the year after, H.G. Wells gained notoriety with his serialized Persons magazine horror story, War of the Worlds, in which ghastly octopus-like Martians storm Earth in their egg-shaped spaceships and take over. Although fictional, these stories were based on prognostications put forward by supposedly sober scientists. The major culprit was the French astronomer and psychic researcher Camille Flammarion. In Stories of Infinity, Lumen, History of a Comet in Infinity, published in 1873, Flammarion interviewed Lumen, a sagacious returning comet, on such topics as the speed of light, time travel, and life on other planets. Lumen: Ah, if you knew the organisms that vibrate on Jupiter or Uranus, you would know that some living beings can understand without eyes, ears, or smell, that there are other faculties of an unascertainable number in nature, essentially different than yours. This idea, called the plurality of worlds hypothesis, is an antediluvian concept which, through the ages, has counted numerous scientists among its adherents. Early astronomers such as Kepler, Newton, Laplace, and Herschel took this position, along with such modern astrophysicists as Carl Sagan. Human beings, grasping the immensity of the cosmos, know that life is not necessarily unique to Earth. Roman and Greek mythology, which concerned the lives and responsibilities of specific deities and included a god for each of the known planets, probably served as a psychological template for astronomers' speculations and corresponding religious beliefs. Carl Jung has linked such mythological thinking to the belief in UFOs, the search for meaning, and the search for God. Identifying God with the unknowable, the unconscious, and the wisdom revealed in dream interpretation, Jung says that the myth arises through attempts by the conscious to understand the unconscious. Thus, the mysteries of outer space are connected with those of inner space. Primordial instincts, archetypes, would therefore be the mechanism evolved through attempts to explain celestial natural phenomena. Over time, these were transformed into the myths of our forefathers. This belief in ancient sky gods and extraterrestrial existence stems from a common motif, that is, that humans cannot be the highest beings in the cosmos, and furthermore, that there is a supreme creator. Because the idea strikes a deep chord, through the centuries numerous scientists, artists, and authors have been seized by this notion. In 1835, Richard Adams Locke of the New York Sun created a series of front-page articles on astronomer Sir John Herschel, discoverer of Uranus, and alleged discoverer of advanced life forms on the moon. Locke's hoax, which spread around the world before it was exposed, was made possible by the fact that Herschel was in South Africa at the time and therefore out of contact with the press. Herschel's supposed discoveries of unicorn-like animals and winged humanoids were made via a marvelous and fictitious telescope that was 150 feet long and could magnify the heavens 42,000 times. 30 years later, Jules Verne journeyed his readers to the moon, but by the late 1870s, the destination had shifted to Mars. The first attempt to create a map of Mars and delineate the features seen on it can be traced back to Bernard de Fontana and Christian Huygens in the mid-1600s. More detailed drawings were sketched by Herschel in 1830 and by numerous other scientists in the 1860s and 1870s, such as Camille Flammarion, and in the 1880s by Giovanni Schiaparelli, who named these channels canali. In two scientific treatises, The Plurality of Worlds and Mars and Its Inhabitants, Flammarion stated his belief that Mars not only housed life, but also intelligent beings. Dwarfed in stature, positioned next to his 15-foot-tall telescope, the bearded French astronomer described in detail the mountains, valleys, craters, lakes, and oceans of Mars in North American Review in 1896. "It is obvious," Flammarion concluded, "the world of Mars is vigorously alive." Perhaps unconsciously influenced by the 1835 New York Sun hoax or Du Maurier's story, Flammarion suggested that due to the lightness of the atmosphere, the inhabitants may have received the privilege of flight. May they not rather be like dragonflies fluttering in the air above the lakes and the canals? Whereas Flammarion only set out to describe the Martians, Tesla actually made plans to contact them. The most influential American proponent, however, was undoubtedly the erudite Percival Lowell, descendant of the famous Massachusetts Lowell family. Influenced by Flammarion, Lowell would capture the front page of the newspapers on many occasions with "Mars Inhabited" headlines. He would also come to author a number of scholarly accounts covered in such prestigious journals as Nature and Scientific American, all culminating in his weighty text, The Canals of Mars, disseminated by the distinguished Macmillan Publishing Company. Unlike the warlike humans of Earth, Martians dwelled in a coordinated world, Lowell speculated. They had outgrown their savage instincts and consciously practiced peace. These Martians were sagacious builders who conserved their precious water and learned to live in a civilized global society. Mars was an older and thus more experienced planet. Its people had lived through the technological revolution eons ago, so they had learned to harvest and cultivate their planet from a global perspective. With humanity at the dawn of a new technological society, it was comforting to think that we would not have to face this rapidly advancing condition alone. As one of a community of intelligent planets, we had neighbours to whom we could turn for guidance. By the late 1890s, Lowell had completed construction of his own gargantuan telescope at Flagstaff, Arizona, where it is still today one of the finest in the world. There he would report each new discovery, including the cataloguing of galaxies, which at the time were called island universes. It's hard to overestimate Lowell's impact on contemporary thinking. For instance, the vegetation hypothesis was echoed by Werner von Braun, Willy Ley, and P. Bonestell, who co-wrote in their 1956 text, The Exploration of Mars, "And this is the picture of Mars at mid-century, a small planet which 3/4 is cold desert, with the rest covered with a sort of plant life, most likely lichen. Mars is not the dead planet, but neither can it be inhabited by the kind of intelligent beings that many people dreamed of in 1900. A society's beliefs determines its reality. But society is made up of individuals, and in the case of the idea that Mars was inhabited, these individuals often embellished their supposed objective scientific findings. Supported vigorously by the press, the most important proponents of the life on Mars scenario were the astronomers, but the position was also championed by the inventors. Elihu Thomson, a long-time stargazer and friend of Professor Pickering's, was so enthusiastic that he often took his telescope to his factories so that workers could see the Martian canal system with their own eyes. Other eminent scientists included Lord Kelvin, who upon his arrival in America in September 1897 announced to the press his idea to flash a signal at night from the glittering metropolis of New York City to Mars to let them know we are here. No doubt he discussed this plan with Tesla when he visited his laboratory during the journey. Edison, too, was caught up in esoteric causes, but his wish was to invent a telephone-like device to contact departed spirits rather than living Martians. The possibility of beckoning Martians was the extreme application of my principle of propagation of electric waves, Mr. Tesla told the interviewers in 1896 in the article, Is Tesla to Signal the Stars? The same principle may be employed with good effects for the transmission of news to all parts of the earth. Every city on the globe could be on an immense circuit. Thus, a message sent from New York would be in England, Africa, and Australia in an instant. What a grand thing it would be. 18. High Society, 1894 to 97. Nikola Tesla is one of the great geniuses and most remarkable men who have ever had anything to do with electricity. It is as much of an honor to propose him for membership as his membership would be an addition to the club. Letter to the Players' Club by Stanford White. Commuting to New Jersey was only a temporary solution, and within a few weeks Tesla returned to New York, where he secured a laboratory just below Greenwich Village near Chinatown at 46 and 48 Houston Street. Nervous and perpetually on the brink of exhaustion, Tesla began to experiment with the healing properties of his oscillators as reports began to filter in from around the country about its remarkable curative properties. These high-frequency vitality boosters would generate a universal healing agent that, when applied, would enable the body to throw off all diseases, said Dr. F. Finch Strong. Effects obtained included increase of strength, appetite, and weight, induction of natural sleep, and elimination. Other doctors reported the ability to cure tuberculosis. Tesla believes that electricity is the greatest of all doctors, and says that when his laboratory was burned, nothing but regular daily applications of electricity kept him from sinking into a state of melancholia. "My high frequencies," he would say, "produce an anti-germicidal action." Thus, as part of his routine for a day at the lab, the inventor would disrobe, step upon his apparatus, and turn on the juice. A prickly corona would envelop his body and restore it to a more pristine condition. Electricity had become the new panacea. It could cure the sick, eradicate the criminals, and even eliminate recalcitrant undergrowth that interfered with the running of trains. Weeding has always been considered very hard work, but with the aid of the electrical weeder, a man has only to touch a button and the weeds vanish. In May 1895, Tesla and the Johnsons attended the dedication ceremony for the new arch, situated as the gateway, looking south to Greenwich Village at Washington Square Park and looking north to the beginning of Fifth Avenue. Designed by Stanford White, the dashing man with the red moustache, the lofty edifice stood taller and wider than any comparable one erected by the mighty ancient Romans or Greeks. Johnson had recited one of his poems in honor of the original wooden one which had been built in 1889. This was but one more connection between Tesla and the celebrated Stanford White, whose many other monuments and buildings were rapidly reshaping the city into a regal testament to the great and vibrant gay era. Tesla would often run into White at the offices of the Century, where the artist would be commissioned to illustrate their covers, and at meetings involving the Niagara Falls enterprise at Delmonico's, the Waldorf and the theatre or the Madison Square Garden Roof restaurant. Having designed the Players Club in Manhattan in 1887, the Tennis Club in Newport, churches and numerous mansions, White was also an interior decorator. It was said that he knew the colour of the boudoir of every woman of note in the city. A trendsetter and sensualist, White became one of the leading choreographers of the ambience of the percolating metropolis. Good friends with the inventor, White often talked with Tesla about their shared vision of the future. Tesla had met White in 1891, when the piano virtuoso Ignacy Paderewski played the Garden for 5 breathtaking performances. Edward Dean Adams was in the midst of courting both men, Tesla for his inventions and White for his architectural prowess, and he wanted to get the two together to discuss the best way to place Westinghouse's behemoth electric generators in the upcoming powerhouse. "My dear Mr. Adams," White wrote, "I duly received the information of the Cataract Construction Company and will pitch in as soon as possible. With McKim in Chicago and Meade in Canada, I am here alone in a sort of maelstrom of work. If it were not for the roof garden and the Valley girls to cheer me up, I should have been dead long ago." By the end of the year, White had sent Adams designs for the proposed buildings. Adams reciprocated by sending White a magnificent text on precious stones and a stunning gift, most likely a ruby or emerald. In 1893, Tesla and White crossed paths again, as both were cardinal participants in the Chicago World's Fair. The following year, White, then 40, urged the inventor to become a member of the Players Club. "Will you not let me put you up for membership?" he inquired. "It is an inexpensive club, and the character of man I think you would like, and I know it would give me the greatest pleasure to meet you there now and then." Tesla requested that Johnson be included for membership, and White agreed. In the heart of winter, in early 1895, White invited Tesla for a little supper for the artist Ned Abbey in my room in the tower, and Tesla sharpened his appetite for the occasion. There in White's sanctuary, where one's mind could spin 1,000 tales, the duo gazed out over the entire city. This moment symbolized the pinnacle of social achievement, for only the elite could enter White's chamber, and only the imagination of the outsiders could discern what might transpire. A month later, the inventor reciprocated by asking White, his wife Bessie, and their son Lawrence to his den. March the 2nd, 1895. My dear Tesla, I cannot thank you too much for your kindness in showing all your wonderful experiments the other day. They made a deep impression on me, as they did everyone, and I'm going to see them again some day if you will let me. Sincerely yours, Stanford White. A fortnight later, the laboratory was in cinders, but for the electronic savant it was almost as if he were simply shifting gears. In the spring, he received a risque invitation to White's outrageous Girl in the Pie banquet. As the story goes, and there are a number of versions, a dozen scantily clad maidens served a 20-course meal at the notorious photography studio of Jimmy Breeze at 5 West 16th Street, the dinners having been shipped from Sherry's. Attending the clandestine affair were other friends of White's, including artists Auguste Saint-Gaudens and Robert Reed, and the inventor Peter Cooper Hewitt. At the culmination of the feast, with the band playing, the young ladies returned in even more provocative outfits, singing and wheeling out a pie the size of a small automobile. To the tune of 24 blackbirds, the crust burst open with a flutter of a flock of canaries, and out popped a topless young woman. Mum was the word until sketchy details were published in the World. Tesla became privy to the architect's salacious activities and may have partaken himself in discreet entanglements, although it is just as likely that his phobia for germs or monastic inclinations would have inhibited him. White admired Tesla as each in his own way was a sculptor of the new age. Meeting occasionally for a round of pool at the Players' Club or at a boxing match, perhaps with Twain at the Garden, Tesla also accompanied White for sailing jaunts out at Southampton with a dozen members of the clique. On one occasion, White asked Tesla to join him for an outing with Mr. William Astor Chamber, an African explorer. As usual, Tesla was busy at work, but after some tactful prodding, he relented. "I am so delighted that you have decided to tear yourself away from your laboratory," White said. "I would sooner have you on board than the Emperor of Germany or the Queen of England." The year 1895 was a peculiar one. The U.S. government was nearing bankruptcy. In the panic of 1893, bondholders had wished to secure gold instead of paper money, and the mint had made good by depleting its reserves. By January 1895, the United States was within days of being unable to meet its debts. Quietly, President Cleveland had asked August Belmont, a wealthy Jewish businessman and backer of the Westinghouse Company, to meet with the European Rothschilds to secure replacement gold reserves. The reality of the day, however, included an unfortunate worldwide wave of anti-Semitism. Only the year before, in a famous trial in France, the Jewish captain Alfred Dreyfus had been convicted on a trumped-up charge of treason. The Rothschilds were Jewish. How would it look to have Jewish financiers bail out an entire nation? It was for this reason, according to Morgan biographer George Wheeler, that J. Pierpont Morgan, an upstanding Episcopalian, was brought into the picture. Morgan, with Belmont's help, was able to secure $60 million in foreign gold reserves, and the country was saved from insolvency. The incident also marked the anointment of Morgan as King of Wall Street. In October, a 22-year-old, well-mannered stenographer named George Scherf walked into Tesla's laboratory and applied for a job. The inventor reviewed the secretary's credentials and hired him. Although Scherf knew nothing about electrical engineering, Tesla was impressed with his demeanor and intelligence, and within a matter of days the youth was busy at work transcribing papers and taking over the general management of the office. In the same month, Tesla forwarded a book on Buddhism to Luca, whom he hadn't seen since the end of the summer. Johnson had travelled with his wife to Italy to receive a decoration from King Humbert for his work on securing a law for international copyright, and during this period Tesla had taken some time to attend lectures in Brooklyn on Buddhism by Swami Vivekananda. "My dear friend and faithful stranger," Johnson wrote back, "I am touched by your remembrance of me in sending the book. I'll drop into your laboratory some day for old acquaintance's sake. Glad to know that you are again in town and established in the beautiful Johnson mansion," Tesla wrote Mrs. Philippoff. "I cannot say as much for my laboratory, which is still in need of furnishing." Tesla reported the local gossip, such as how Stanford had difficulty in deciding between which of two beautiful sisters to spend an evening with, the gist of Swami Vivekananda's lectures on the external nature of God and the transmigration of souls, and of his progress in netting more millionaires. He was meeting with railroad magnate and U.S. Senator Chauncey Depew, J. Beaver Webb, a fleet captain, shipbuilder, and Morgan man, Darius Ogden Mills, a stock market manipulator and principal in GE, and John Jacob Astor. The wealthiest of the crew, except for Astor, was undoubtedly Mills, who had made his fortune in San Francisco during the California gold rush. Owner of the New York Tribune and a palace on Fifth Avenue opposite St. Patrick's Cathedral, of which a Shah of Persia might have been proud, Mills had been the second private citizen in history, after J. Pierpont Morgan, to have his abode illuminated by electricity. As Herbert Satterlee tells the story, Mills was so impressed with the Edison invention that he insisted on becoming a partner in the company. "Only if for every share of Edison stock you purchase for yourself, you purchase one for me," Morgan replied, and Mills agreed. Tesla had much to tell his European travelling friends. At the end of the year, Tesla began to apply more pressure on Edward Dean Adams to influence John Jacob Astor. The Colonel, as he was now called, was funding of all people mountebank John Worrell Keely. This was a situation that had to be changed. Keely's motor hadn't motored in 20 years. Tesla's had turned the world. Martin wrote the inventor of his astonishment at Astor's gullibility. Tesla pressed Astor for a commitment. Attempting perhaps to capitalize on the Christmas spirit, Tesla met with Astor and his nautical counselor, J. Beaver Webb, on December the 19th and pitched his cause. "I am impressed with your endeavor, Mr. Tesla," Astor commented, "although, as I understand it, your latest inventions are yet to reach the point of being marketed. Nevertheless, I'll speak to Mr. Adams. By all means, let's keep the door open." Tesla telephoned Adams that afternoon and wrote Astor the following day. "My dear Mr. Astor, Adams would be only too glad to have you with us. We agreed that we would jointly provide from 500 to 1,000 shares of the parent company for yourself and Mr. Webb at the price of $95 a share of a par value of $100 each. The parent company owns my patents and rights in foreign and domestic markets, which I believe will profoundly affect the present state of the mechanical and electrical arts, and will create a greater revolution in their applications than my ideas on the transmission of power, which are at present generally adopted." Christmas was drawing near, and with it the renewal of the Serb's link to his adopted American family. The invitation from the Johnsons was wholeheartedly welcomed. "My dear Luca," Tesla wrote, "I am, as you know, very fond of millionaires, but the inducements you offer are so great that I shall set them aside to partake in the splendid lunch which Madame Philippoff will prepare. For Christmas I want to be at home, 327 Lexington Avenue, with my friends, my dear friends, the Johnsons. If you will prepare a dinner for a half-dozen and invite nobody, it will suit me. We shall talk of blessed peace and be merry until then." Tesla did his best to overlook the erotic tension emanating from Catherine as she directed the servants with Agnes to set the dinner table, and Tesla talked shop with Robert and his son Owen. Catherine could never be part of the bond that existed between Tesla and Robert. Her heart ached for what it could not have, and yet simultaneously was filled with what it now possessed. With Robert out of the room, Catherine was too intense. She claimed a telepathic link to the wizard. Her breast palpitated when he was near. Hormones gushed. On one occasion she edged them to the line. He had no choice but to withdraw. On the last day of the year, Stamford dropped off a note. He wanted Tesla to hire a promising lad, the son of his friend Charlie Barney, a banker with ties to Whitney and Vanderbilt. "My dear Mr. White," Tesla wrote back, "I heartily agree that the young fellow who has two awfully pretty sisters ought to be helped by all means." Unfortunately, Tesla continued, he still had the responsibility of carrying 3 superfluous workmen, who were not really working because of the delay caused by the fire. As the relationship with the Johnsons became more intimate, there may have been rivalries between them over which one had the greater access to him. Tesla wrote after the New Year, "My dear Luca, I am glad to know you shall love me, but I am much disappointed to learn that the boil has bothered you so much. I doubt, however, that you are a hero, because heroes do not go to bed on account of a boil." Although Catherine had seen Tesla twice in December, it only served to ignite her passion even more. Torn between loving a professorial and delightful gentleman who could count among his friends Mark Twain, John Muir, Rudyard Kipling, and Teddy Roosevelt, even if he did suffer from boils, and an exotic internationally known virtuoso whose singular talents promised to transform an entire world, Catherine wanted to feel herself en rapport with the wizard so that she could discuss their psychic link. February the 12th, 1896. Dear Mr. Tesla, I have had such a wonderful experience the past 3 years. So much of it is already gone that I sometimes fear it will all pass away with me, and you, of all persons, ought to know something of it, for you could not fail to have a scientific interest in it. I call it thought transference, for want of a better word. Perhaps it is not at all that. I have often wished and meant to speak to you of this, but when I am with you, I never say the things I had intended to say. I seem to be only capable of one thing. Do come tomorrow. Sincerely yours, Catherine Johnson. Stamford might have been able to leave his wife on Long Island while he courted young starlets at his bachelor pad at Gramercy Park or his private loft atop the Garden Tower, but dear Mr. Tesla was cut from different cloth. He would often dine with women and tantalize with his eyes, but that would have to be the extent of a relationship. Apparently, Tesla undertook a self-imposed vow of chastity, having been influenced in part by Swami Vivekananda, who preached chastity as the path to self-transformation and enlightenment. Tesla met the Swami on February the 13th, 1896, at a dinner with Sarah Bernhardt, after one of her performances in the play Isiel. As with the rest of the world, Tesla had first heard of the Swami during the summer of 1893, when the Hindu gained overnight prominence after speaking at the Congress of World Religions, which had been held at the Chicago World's Fair. As Tesla had been in Chicago within a month of the talk, it is conceivable that he met or saw the Swami speak at that time. Vivekananda told the great electrician about Vedantic prana, life force, and Akasha, ether, which according to Tesla are the only theories modern science can entertain. Having studied Madame Blavatsky's theosophical teachings, Tesla was already versed in the idea of Akasha and the Akashic records, which are, in essence, the records of all historical events existing in some vibratory state in this ether. The Brahma, or universal mind, the Swami continued, produces Akasha and prana. Tesla agreed with the essential premise of this Buddhist view, replying that the theory could be proved mathematically by demonstrating that force and matter are reducible to potential energy. And then the inventor invited Swami Vivekananda, some of his devotees, and Sarah Bernhardt to his laboratory for the following week to demonstrate through experiments this principle. After Tesla showed the Swami some of his creations, the Swami advised that pure creation in the sense that something was born from nothing was not possible. To Swami Vivekananda, creation was a process of combining existing elements into a new synthesis. This idea of the eternal nature of existence, with no beginning and no ending, was appealing to Tesla, and he later referred to this and related concepts in some of his writings. Today, this theory in cosmology refers to the steady-state theory of eternal creation, which would oppose the more generally accepted Big Bang theory, which hypothesizes a particular date for the beginning of time. The reason that the Big Bang theory is the more generally accepted one is because the universe is expanding. Working backward, it appears logical that all matter in the universe was together at one time in one location. Current estimates place the Big Bang at about 15 billion years ago. How Astor could be taken in by Keely was a mystery to Tesla, for the financier declined at this time to partake in the venture. He had taken a month to consider the proposal. January the 18th, 1896. Dear Mr. Tesla, your letter offering me some of your oscillator stock received. 95 seems rather a high price, for though the inventions covered by the stock will doubtless bring about great changes, they may not pay for some time as yet, and of course there are always a good many risks. Wishing the oscillator as much success as I could if financially interested, and hoping soon to be able to use one myself, I remain yours sincerely, John Jacob Astor. Although a rejection, the letter was not a complete denial. It was going to take one or two more go-arounds to land this big fish. The oscillators for Tesla, of course, were never ends in and of themselves. Tesla's goal was to send energy into the earth and use it as a conduit to transmit messages and power. Details of the plan, however, were such a tightly held secret that even his workers were not completely confided in. Somewhat surreptitiously, Tesla took a train to Colorado Springs in late February 1896 to look over a prospective site for a new laboratory, and also to conduct the kinds of wireless experiments he had wanted to undertake before his laboratory burned to the ground. Tesla instructed a colleague, perhaps a local engineering professor, to transmit a musical song on an autoharp through Pikes Peak to his receiving equipment, which included another autoharp attuned to the first 4 miles away on the other side of the mountain. The experiment was a success. The song, Ben Bolt, played on one side of the mountain, was picked up by means of a resonant earth frequency on the other. Tesla, however, completely confounded the details of the instrumentation involved. By implying to the press that the energy utilized derived from the earth and not from one of his oscillators, Tesla also succeeded in generating hyperbolic headlines as well. Based on this false premise, page 1 of the March 8, 1896 Sunday magazine section of The World announced not only Tesla's historic wireless achievement, but also the supposed experimental verification that the Earth was imbued with free energy of essentially unlimited amounts. By tapping this reservoir, the future was clear. Electricity would be as free as air. The end has come to telegraph, telephone companies, and other monopolies with a crash. 19. Shadowgraphs, 1896. The rising claims of the inventors revives an incident in connection with the discovery of the Röntgen ray. Oliver Lodge announced apparatus by which he saw through a man. A few days later, Mr. Edison proclaimed that he had apparatus with which he had seen through 2 men. Within a week, Mr. Tesla produced rays of such penetrating power that they went clear through 3 men. When this was shown to Mr. Edison, the great man, who hasn't a spark of jealousy in his nature, smiled and said, "Well, let's stop it at 3. What do you say? I think 3 men will do as well and prove as much as a regiment." New York Mail and Express. A few days before the new year, the scientific world was shaken by the remarkable discovery by Wilhelm Röntgen of a queer unknown energy that he called X-rays, which emanated from his Leonard and Crookes tubes. Mikhail Pupin wrote, "No other discovery within my lifetime has ever aroused the interest of the world as did the discovery of the X-rays. Every physicist dropped his own problems and rushed headlong into the research." Astonishingly, Pupin added, "To the best of my knowledge, I was at that time the only physicist here who had had any laboratory experience with vacuum tube research. I obtained the first X-ray photograph in America on January 2, 1896, 2 weeks after the discovery was announced in Germany."